the potential, and you can see some of the exciting stuff that have been put up. I'm really eager to really get a look at it tomorrow and go through exhibit by exhibit.
Why do you think Atlanta was the right place to move this, or the College Football Hall of Fame in particular?
Well, Atlanta's pedigree as a capital of college football, not just in the South, but really around the country. It's a built-in magnet for college football fans. It's obviously got a perfect central location. The passion for the sport in this city runs about as deep as anywhere. So it seemed pretty logical to me. I don't think you get too many people, maybe a few Northerners, but not too many people would argue about this choice.
Overall impressions of this season, surprises, anything else?
When weren't there surprises? I mean, you have so many crazy finishes and endings this year that in any year would stand out as being the wackiest thing you've seen, yet almost every week produce something else. So I think the unpredictability of it, I mean, college football is kind of a crazy, messy, sloppy sport in a beautiful way. I mean, that to me is the beauty of it. And you had so many games that went down to triple zeros and beyond on the clock every week, and not just games on the fringe of the radar, but games that shaped the championship chase. The 4 teams that end up in the playoff were involved in those kinds of games too. So, I mean, that's what I'm going to remember about it. And then I hope we have a playoff that punctuates the season the way last year's did. And I have high hopes for that.
Surprising to not have at least one fan base who just completely disagrees with how the 4 shook out.
I'm sure there's always fan bases that are going to disagree. I mean, I think that the disagreement comes, why isn't it 8 teams? I mean, I think we've heard David Shaw, maybe some Stanford fans, maybe some Ohio State fans, and others say that to them, a 4-team doesn't make sense. I've been a playoff proponent for a long, long time, welcome the change, want to see how 4 teams works for a while before we expand, but I do think that, like every other postseason format in every sport, I think expansion is a very realistic possibility. But for now, I'm good with the 4 teams, and I think, yeah, you're right. It's pretty clear cut. You got a lot of people that spent hundreds of hours prepping to make a decision that pretty much any fan could have made in about 15 seconds, which maybe isn't a bad thing.
You look more rested since you got off game day. I mean, but did you get any withdrawals?
Deceptive. I did not miss the early wake-up calls on Saturday. I'll tell you that. I missed certain parts about not doing the show, coming on the air, going off the air with the headgear pick is kind of a signature moment that we created and Mr. Corso created, and I do miss not being out there for that. But being able to focus on 2 teams in the game on Saturday night at a much different level than I could before has been fun for me, and like I said, I don't mind sleeping in and having a nice workout. I'd be a steam on Saturday morning while those guys are out there on the set.
Prepping for a game is hard enough, but how much hours would you estimate that you probably prepped of doing 2 full-time jobs?
I mean, look, I mean, there's a lot harder jobs. I studied hard, but I loved the subject, so it never felt like drudgery. But the kinds of preparation you do for a pregame show are so different than what you do for the game. There was some overlap, but really it's so broad, the number of games you have to know for game day, and I really sweated the details and the information. It's why I didn't sleep much on Friday nights, because things were breaking late. Information came flooding in on Friday from all of our sources, and so I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss something. A game is totally different, and I love being able to dive down deep and prepare for 2 teams in a different way than I could last year.
What do you think of the 2 playoff matchups we have? What intrigues you about each of the 2 semifinal games?
Well, I mean, two different styles of play that might look like different sports. I mean, you start off with the spread, frenetic, fast game down in Miami, where you've got dynamic multi-threat quarterbacks. On paper, you might see a lot of points would be scored. And then you've got 22 guys swinging sledgehammers in a phone booth in Arlington.
Yeah.
And I think that that's going to look more like the games that we see on Sunday, or maybe an old school football game. So I think it's interesting. You'll have, no matter who wins each of the semifinals, you have a contrast in styles in the championship game. Obviously, there's plenty of other plot lines. The payback plot line that has been a signature of Oklahoma's season so far. The potential for that to continue is really interesting, because their embarrassing loss to Clemson fueled their whole run. If they don't get blown out in that bowl game and lose 5 games, I don't think that there's the the fuel to have this kind of season. They vowed never again, and they've gone and avenged 4 losses already, and they have a chance to do the 5th. And Brent Venables' defense trying to smother the school where he used to work is again a storyline on this a much bigger stage than it was last year. Mayfield and Watson is as good a quarterback matchup as you'll have. And then of course in Texas, you've got a Saban assistant not just trying to beat Nick, but trying to get close to him, which none of them ever have. He's never even come close to losing to a former assistant, and obviously a program that he helped build at Michigan State. So there's a lot there. You've got an Alabama team that was very deeply disappointed, furious that they lost to last year's Big Ten champion after having a 21-6 lead, then went and watched Ohio State win the title. And that's, to me, what's fueled them all year. So it's kind of, there's good symmetry there. Here we go again. It's the Big Ten champion in the way. They're expected to win, but they were expected to win last year. So Michigan State has to me, been the outlier of the group, because I've seen them a couple times. I've watched them on TV plenty, and I don't think they've hit their top gear yet, which is a nice luxury to have 12 wins when you haven't hit your top gear. Their defense has come together late in the year. They've gotten more experience. They've gotten burned less. Obviously, they've shown that toughness that marks the program late in games with these long grinding drives. But to me, they're going to have to hit their top gear and then some if they want to beat Alabama. So that is the interesting element to that game. Can you go toe-to-toe with Bama? Can you hit enough big plays downfield to stretch the defense? I think Connor Cook's got to have his best game.
The local story here, Mark Richt, probably one of the most successful coaches in Georgia history, being shown the door, but Kirby Smart coming in. I guess your interactions with him, probably production meetings. What impressions have you had from him in terms of talking football with him, and what maybe leads you to believe he can be successful at his new stop?
Well, I think first of all, he brings a deep love and a heritage with the program, which is important. I think that you're always, I think, embraced, and when you come back as a former Georgia player. I mean, Kirby is a very, very bright defensive mind. I mean, you don't need me to say that. Everybody sort of knows that. Again, you have to sort of imagine the guy as a head coach, because it's a role that he's never played. So my dealings with Kirby have been breaking down Alabama's defensive personnel and their game plan, not sitting back and hearing about his vision as the boss of a program. So like any top flight assistant who is the quote next big thing, I think there's a risk, because he would have to admit there's going to be uncharted territory for him. And it's not a little program, it's the University of Georgia. So you're immediately in the spotlight. You're immediately responsible for so many more things than you were in Tuscaloosa, where assistants were sort of kept out of the spotlight by Coach Saban. And so now he's very much in a bright spotlight with a lot to learn on the job. But, you hope he can be a Bob Stoops, a Jimbo Fisher, a guy who took over a very visible program, debuting as a head coach and had great success. There have been many who have failed in that role too. So I'm really eager to see how he embraces and how he handles it. But I think it's an unknown.
Chris, Georgia obviously lost Nick Chubb early on. They could still end up winning 10 games this year. Mark Richt gets fired. Does that surprise you? And what does that say about college football?
I think what it says about college football is that there is very little patience and very little tolerance for sustained excellence. You always have to continue to raise the bar. I mean, I'm not going to say that. I mean, Georgia has the right to make whatever decision, and I'm not inside the program. And if a fresh energy is deemed to be needed, you make a business decision and you bring in a guy that represents fresh energy. I think maybe Mark Richt would welcome a fresh challenge. Was he unemployed for about 15 minutes? I mean, he popped up down in Miami, where obviously he's got a history, and he's going to be embraced, and he's going to get a chance to put his stamp on that program. So, I mean, nothing surprises me. Mm-hmm. Nothing surprises me when it comes to the comings and goings of coaches anymore. I mean, I'm beyond being surprised. But I think it can end up being one of those changes that maybe was forced upon Mark to some degree, but will end up really being good for him, and perhaps even good for the University of Georgia. I think what's interesting to me about this year is that Bob Stoops and Kirk Ferentz are in their 17th years of their programs. Both those guys have heard grumblings. Both of those guys have heard the complaints that maybe it's time for some fresh energy at those places too. And when Frank Beamer retires after the bowl game, those two guys are going to be the longest tenured FBS coaches at one school. They both had tremendous years in their 17th season. So you never know when it's time to pull the plug and move on, because coaches who have that quality are always capable of sort of rekindling the fire at their programs. And it was interesting to me that both of those guys in their 17th year had phenomenal years.
Chris,